So I'm going to click on the Playmaker menu and open up the Playmaker editor. And I'm going to recommend that you take the Playmaker editor window and dock it to the right of the project folder. So I'm going to grab the tab, drag it down and snap it to the right side of the project folder. That'll organize your workspace a little better. So again, I'll take the Playmaker editor window, grab it by the tab, and just drag it down into the right of the project folder. Snap it there. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Playmaker drop-down menu. Under the editor windows menu, I'm going to go to Action Browser. And that's going to open up all the actions. And you can either snap that to the right of your inspector, like so, or towards like the bottom half of the inspector. So we want to be able to have access to the inspector and the actions at the same time. Because my screen real estate's a little bit limited, I'm going to snap mine down towards the bottom, just because I'm a little more compact than you are. So we're going to get started really quick and try to cut through some of the technical bits as quick as possible so we can start designing our own games. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is create a game object that is a cube. So I'm going to go to the Game Object menu, 3D Object Cube, and before I even modify this cube, I'm going to call it Ground. So I'm going to highlight the name inside the hierarchy and just call it Ground. Simple little ground cube. I'm going to orbit around so that I'm looking in the direction of Z. This is a very important concept when it comes to the orientation of space in game design. We want to be looking down the blue axis. So I just held down the Option key, clicked and dragged and orbited around so that the blue axis is more or less pointing away from us. Now, when we look at 3D space, we have our Y up axis, if you recall, and now the red axis or the X axis is pointing left and right, and Z is back in space. And this is really important for 2D games and 2.5D games because we want to operate on Y and X and use the Z as the foreground background space. You'll notice that the widget in the top right-hand corner kind of corresponds to this cube for now, and that's dealing with local and world space. Okay, this object has its own orientation in space and it has its own axes, but it happens to be lining up for now with the world space. If we rotated that cube, its z-axis might be pointing in a different direction, but we don't want that. Okay, so but by default, this is pointing in the same direction as your world space z, and we'll talk about the implications of that in a bit. I am going to change the x scale of my ground cube to something like 30 so that it kind of fills the screen. And I'm going to change the Z or the depth to 5. So it kind of gives us a plane to work on. And before I get too far into the setup of this space, I'm very quickly going to have a bunch of white assets that I can't see. Okay, so I want to get started by creating some simple swatches. And rather than just creating some random swatches, I want to start with I want to kind of consider my my color space that I'm going to work in for now. We're not going to etch this in stone, but there's two ways that I'd recommend getting started with color, maybe three. One is finding a design or a photograph that has a color palette that interests you, or going to color.adobe.com, where there's lots of different color profiles, and we can go to the Explorer tab. This is going to give us some color swatches that we can quickly look at and say, okay, this is kind of the the color range that I want to work in for this game, or at least for now something to get us started. We don't have to overthink this at this point. The other thing that we could do, I'm going to open up a new browser window. We could go to Dribble. It's with 3 Bs. This is a it's kind of like social media for designers. It's been around for a very long time. And we could look at, just different designs. And maybe there's this illustration of this donkey over here. I don't know what it is. Or there's this sky. And maybe I like the color profile, the colors that are being used in this design. I'll click on it. And I can either capture this image, or if I scroll down, it'll give me kind of a color profile of what's being used. So the trick that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small screenshot slice of either Adobe, the color.adobe.com, and grab some of these swatches, or I'm going to go to Dribble and do the same thing. And I'm going to take a screenshot, but I'm going to be selective about my screenshot. So if I hold down Command-Shift-4, I release my hands, but I have a little marquee here. Command-Shift-4 will give you the marquee. If you want to undo this, you can hit Escape, but this is what we want. And I'm going to click and drag and make a selection, and I'm going to click and drag and make the selection over top of the color swatches. When I release that, if I had my audio turned up, you would hear a little snapshot. And I'm going to jump out to my desktop, and you can see that I have a screenshot now of these color swatches. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into Unity. I'm going to go to Assets, Import New Asset. I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to find that screenshot, and I'm going to import that.
What was the keys you used?
Command-Shift-4. Number 4, the number key is across the top of the keyboard, not the keypad. And you should get a little marquee that pops up.
Okay.
And let me know if you got, you're having it, if it's not turning up for you. Okay, so at this point, what I'll do is, just to simplify this a little bit, typically I have my assets listed as a list. We have this little slider here that we slide it down and we see a list, but I'm going to blow this up as large as I can to get a thumbnail of this, because I can sample from these colors. I don't really need to open it. I don't need to place it in order to do this. I'm going to right click inside my assets folder, and I'm going to create a new material. And this new material, I'm just going to call it ground for now. And I'm going to reorganize this in a minute. So I have my material selected, but I'm scrolling down to find my screenshot. Okay, you with me? So I have my inspector is focused on my material that I made, but I've found my color swatch in my project folder. I'm going to go over to my ground material, and I like to turn the smoothness way down for basic materials just to get rid of that reflection, that glossy reflection. We can always change that later. And I'm going to click on this white swatch next to the albedo field, and that brings up this color picker. Okay, so I have this color picker for this material, and I have access to my color swatch here. Okay, I'm going to grab the eyedropper. It's in the top left-hand corner of this color picker, and once I do, you can see that I can sample anything from this screen. As I roll around, it's giving me a pixel preview of the screen. I'm just going to roll down here, and I'm going to sample that first color swatch. Okay, now rather than using this for my ground plane, I'm going to sample all these colors, and I'm going to set them as a swatch. I'm going to trip over my bag. It's going to tangle around my foot. So I'll give you an opportunity to give that a go. Once you have your color up and selected, before we commit to it, down here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a color swatch, and right now that color swatch is previewing the color that we have selected. Okay? And what we can do is we can turn that into a color swatch that we can remember by clicking on that swatch. What's happening is when we click on that, it gets entered into our swatch palette. And now I'm going to go back up to the eyedropper, and I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to sample the second color. I'm going to click on the swatch, grab the eyedropper, and just kind of continue to work through this and sample, maybe not all the colors, but all the colors that I want. And I do like the greens that are being used here. I just got to remember to click on that add swatch before I move on. Okay, and we can always go back and kind of get rid of these colors if we don't end up using them. But for now, we have these all these color swatches down here. And we can do that with multiple, we don't have to stick to just the sample that we've taken. But now technically we don't even really need this, but I'm going to keep it as a color sample. Now, before I spend too much time building out all these materials, I made this material in the root of my assets folder, and I want to stay organized, so I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to right click, create new folder, and call this materials. And I'll drag and drop my ground material into my material. So I'm just organizing them. I'll double click and go into my materials, and I'll do this very fast and give you an opportunity to kind of catch up, because it's really just a workflow thing at this point. I'm going to select my ground material and choose Command D. That'll duplicate that material. And I'm simply going to call this, I'll call it swatch 1 for now. I'm not too concerned with the names. I'm going to click and open up my color sample, and I'm going to choose the next color swatch. And I'll close. I'll select swatch 1, Command D to duplicate, go into swatch 2, open up the color, and so I'm just sampling these colors and close. Take swatch 2, Command D to duplicate. I could duplicate these all at the same time out front. But I'll just do this very quickly. Okay. Throw a material on my ground plane. Okay, so I got a little bit of contrast. I'm going to create a new game object. I'm going to start with a cube, and that cube is going to represent my player for now. And I'm going to take one of my swatches and just, use that to add color to my player. And I'm going to change the name of cube to player for now. Okay, so I have this ground plane, I have this player. Now the position of my player, again, I'm looking down the Z space, but I noticed that the position of the player is kind of wonky. It's not showing up at the center of my world space. And I'm not so concerned about why, because I want it to be above the ground plane. But the X position is off. I'm going to zero out the X position, and I'm going to zero out the Z position. And that should put it in a more kind of comfortable space for now. I'm going to look through my camera. I'm going to select my camera. And that is just kind of giving me a preview of what I'm seeing down here in the bottom right corner. Just a temporary look through my camera. And I'm going to recompose my camera just a little bit. Not too much, but I'm just going to lift up the camera, and then drag it to the right. So I'm recomposing this a little bit so the player has a little bit more space off to the right. Okay. Now I see the end of my ground plane, and this is only just a temporary reference right now. So I'm going to select my ground plane and make that much bigger along the X. I'll probably do like 50 for now. Okay, just so I don't see the end of it. I'm going to go back and select my player. With my player selected, I'm going to add a component to it. So I'm going to go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body. This is going to be a physics-based game to get started. We can change that later, but we'll start off with basic physics. So if we hit the play button, or we hold down Command and hit the P key, we can run our game, and we should basically just see this player fall to the ground and land on the ground. Okay, if we got that, we're in good shape. That's where we need to be. And now we're going to start to build out a little bit of control for the player. We're basically going to build kind of a simple jump mechanic for this, but we're going to do it in a way that we can kind of continuously add a jump force or an upward pointing force. So we're going to just jump right back into Playmaker. I'm going to build this mechanic very quickly. If this feels clumsy to you, don't be concerned, because we'll just kind of repeat it as needed. With the player selected, I'm going to go find the Playmaker editor window and right click and add FSM. Okay, so we're adding a state machine. The first state of our state machine, we're going to select it, make sure that it's highlighted. I'm going to go to the State tab of the Playmaker editor, where I'm going to highlight the state Thruster01 label, and I'm going to change the name of it to idle. Okay, we want to make sure that all of our state labels are named according to what function they're providing, so that when we go back into our mechanics, we can quickly kind of figure out what's happening. I'm going to right-click and add another state, and this is going to be the thrusting state. Or flying, if you want to, but we'll call it thrusting for now. And then I'm going to go back to my idle state. And from my idle state, I'm going to go to my actions panel, and I'm going to listen for some keyboard input. I want to listen for now for, I'll listen for a key, and I might change this to a mouse later, but I'm going to go to the input category, and I'm looking for get key down. Not get button down, but get key down. And I'll double click, get key down. And for now, we're going to listen to the space key. So for the key drop-down menu, probably about 8 items down is the space key. So we'll listen for that. And we're going to create a send event. So when we press the space bar, I'm going to click this send event drop-down menu and choose to create a new event. This event, we're going to call it, we'll simply call it next. This is going to be a very simple state machine. So I'll call it next, capital. I like to capitalize all of my state machines, labels, and send events. So we get this warning saying, well, wait a second, you have a send event that's not being utilized on your state, and we can fix that by simply clicking on this error, and it'll fix it for us. And now I'm going to wire the next event over to thrusting. Okay, so basically what we've done there is we've set up a simple idle state that listens for our key, our space bar, to go down, and if we do, we end up in the thrusting state, and this is testable, so we can test this just to make sure that things are working. I'm going to press the space bar, and now we get stuck in the thrusting state. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to be able to listen to whether our space bar is down or up. So we want to be able to mash the space bar and hold it down and continuously stay in the thrusting state until we release the key. Okay, so what kind of event might we listen for over here that's similar that would send us back to get key up? And we'll listen for the space bar. We're listening for the release of the space bar in our thrusting state. So we'll select thrusting. We're going to go find get key up. We're going to load in the space is what we're listening for. And the send event, we actually could use the next send event here, but I'm going to create a new event just to get in the habit of creating events. And I'm going to call this reset. Hit return. I'll use that little cheat of clicking on the error to fix it and apply the transition event to our second state. And now I'm going to wire the reset back to the idle state. So your state machine should look something like this. It's a simple toggle mechanic that we've just built. We can test this. We can hit the play button. And as long as our mouse is over our scene view, we should be able to tap and hold the space bar. And it should stay in the thrusting state until we release the space bar, just to confirm that it's working okay. I'm going to go back to the thrusting state, and this is where we want to start to add a force. We want to lift our player off the ground so that as we're pressing the space bar, it's the equivalent of lifting it up in space. And that's going to be done by going to physics. So I'm going to go find the physics category, not physics 2D, but physics in the actions window. So I'm going to go to physics, add force, and I'll double click. And I want to make sure that I'm adding force on the thrusting state. This is the place we want to add force. I'm going to go find the y-axis because that's the axis I want to send it up. I want to send it up on the y-axis. On the y-axis, there's a drop-down menu which suggests that I would use a variable. We're not going to use variables just yet. I'm going to click on the equal sign, which allows me to go to a hard value. And I'm going to key in a value. And I'm not sure what I need here, so I'm going to type in 50. I'm not sure how much force I need, but I'm going to type in 50. And I want to apply this force every frame that we stay inside this state. So as long as we're in the state, we're constantly adding force. So I want to make sure that every frame is checked. Otherwise, it'll just basically be a jump mechanic. It'll just launch it up a little bit and fall right back down. But when we say every frame, it'll continuously, cumulatively add force as long as we're in that state. So I'm going to test this. I'm going to hit play. I'm going to let it fall to the ground, and I'm going to smash the space bar. And if yours is anything like mine, my player just launched off the screen. I have no idea where it's at. Okay, so it's very sensitive, which means I have probably too much force. Okay, but I can start, I have this really simple mechanic where I can kind of do this like little keep it off the ground kind of thing. Okay.
Did you change it from world?
Not yet. I kept it at world, and I'm glad you mentioned that because when my, it ignores what direction the cube is pointing in, and we're going to need to fix that. So, so in fact, let me demonstrate that really quickly. What Monique just brought up, or Unique just brought up, sorry, is that if we go to thrusting, you'll notice that add force, it asks us what space we want to add this force in. And right now it's using the world space to add force, which means that regardless of what direction our object, our game object is in, regardless of what direction these axes are pointing, it's going to use the world space axes to apply that force, which is, you know, might be something that we want to do. But in this case, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to tip our player, you know, rotate it left and right basically, and then cause it to move in that direction. So imagine if we're adding a force up on the y-axis, but it's not relative to the world space, to where as we rotate, it's always pushing upwards, but it's relative to the world space, or it's relative to the game object space, or self space. To demonstrate this, you don't have to do this. I'm going to go to the rotation, and I'm going to rotate Z a little bit here. And I'll move this up to give myself a little bit more room. When I hit the play button, and I'm going to catch it from hitting the ground, hopefully, you can see that it goes straight up into the air, even though my cube is pointing in the wrong direction. So it's kind of, you know, flopping around, and it still just moves up and down. The reason it's drifting to the right is because it probably hit the ground. But you can see it's always moving straight up in the air, okay? If I toggle the play button and go to thrusting, and I come back down here and I change this to self space, we're sending it along the y-axis of the game object now, which in this case is pointing off to the left. So we basically have this like thrust that's coming out from the bottom. We're sending this object along its own x. So now if I hit the play button, we're not using the world axes, we're using the direction of the player. Okay, and that's the difference between self space and world space. If that feels a little abstract, don't worry about it. That'll start to fall in place, you know, as we move forward. So I'm going to take my rotation and set that back to 0. I'm going to take my force down to 20, and this is something you'll just have to dial in. We'll have to work back and forth and figure out what we want to do. But that pretty much wraps up our thrust mechanic for now until we start tracking how much, you know, until we start tracking some variables down the road, like maybe fuel consumption or time, how often we're pressing it, and so on. The last thing that I want to do before I wrap up this thrust mechanic is I want to go to the FSM tab of thrust. And so right now we have an FSM, a finite state machine. This is the mechanic for the thrusting. And I want to label it so. So I'm going to take the FSM, I'm going to keep that there, but I'm going to add a space and call this FSM thrust. Okay, and the reason that I want to do that is we're going to start having multiple state machines on the same game object, and we need to be able to differentiate what the mechanic is. And you'll notice that over on the right side in your inspector, if you look through this, there's a playmaker component, and it says that it's the FSM thrust. Okay, so this is how we're going to identify these mechanics, and that'll become a little bit more clear here in just a minute.